Lovely. So thank you so much for the opportunity to, oh, sorry, just quickly, Tamsin, can you see that, the slides? Yep, fantastic, lovely. All right, well, thank you so much for inviting me along here today. It's been really interesting. As Tamsin just said, I have been going to the other plenaries, mainly because I was curious and I wanted to make sure I wasn't going to overlap too much, but actually I found they were quite interesting and lots of different perspectives. And when I saw the theme of this particular conference, I thought, it would be really interesting to see all the different angles that we could approach this from. But before I dive into the meat of my speech, I guess you could say, I will do what most of my other previous speakers have done, which is just to acknowledge country. So I'm here in Melbourne and I'm on the land of the Wurundjeri people, the Kulin Nation. So I do acknowledge these people and as the traditional custodians on the land on which we now meet. I also pay my respects to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people of Australia and hope that the path towards reconciliation continues to be shared and embraced. And I also acknowledge the Indigenous people of the lands on which you all come from, because I know we have people from all around the world here. So it's really exciting to see the different cultures, to meet the different people across the different nations. So thank you for that. So as Tamsin has mentioned before, I kind of have two roles at Swinburne. The first is I'm an associate professor of learning analytics, and that's my research area, and it's something I'm quite interested in exploring in a little bit more. And I must admit, this presentation won't be about learning analytics per se, but it will pop up every now and then. But my other substantive role here at Swinburne is as the director of the Learning Transformations Unit. And that's a little bit more relevant, I think, to what I would like to talk about today. So when I had a look at the theme of what the conference was all about, I looked at the sort of main three words that come up: technology, knowledge, and society. And I thought, well, there's so much about these three words that impact what I do on a day-to-day basis, impact, that area of higher education more broadly. And so I thought, right, so if I look at these three words and I take that idea of viral, which of course is also a theme of the conference, and of course, and the other point there about opportunities and challenges. And I thought, how do I bring this together? I'm sure my other plenary speakers will probably look at some of the nuts and bolts. We'll look at some of those big ideas. So Gregor's presentation this morning was that idea of what's the role of the campus moving forward. We heard some fantastic insights into what Boston University was doing, which was last night in terms of my time zone. And that was really interesting to hear the different perspectives from a teacher's perspective, but also from the students' perspective, and getting a bit of an idea of what the students were experiencing throughout all of this. And of course, we had that other presentation last night that looked at more specifically, a different way that teaching can be done, and a really interesting look at the way that technology kind of pervades people's lives. So I looked at all of those and I thought, oh, that's really, that's a really great spectrum. So I thought I might just tell some stories, because I figured that, for these three themes in particular, there were three things that I think I experienced during the pandemic last year. And I will say it is a little bit, possibly a little bit too me focused, but these are three things that I experienced because I went through a really interesting transition last year. I started the year just as the Associate Professor of Learning Analytics at Swinburne, and I ended the year as a director of an entire unit. And that was obviously a result of the pandemic as well. But it gave me a number of different perspectives and views on what was happening in our institution in particular, but I suspect that it was probably a fairly similar story in your institutions as well. So for us, the first story, I guess, that relates very much to this idea of technology is the idea of accelerating existing change. So we were already on a bit of a change path in terms of our technology that we were using in our institution for learning and teaching and research and all the rest, but particularly in terms of learning and teaching. So of course, the pandemic and everything that happened last year and is continuing to happen to some extent really accelerated some existing change happening within the institution. And I think all institutions, whether they're higher ed or any other kind of institution, I guess, are always changing. And I guess it's certainly in higher education with the pace of the emerging technologies and all the different opportunities that educational technologies offer, we're often moving towards change, or we're moving through change continually. So we had a bit of an acceleration of ours. But I think through this acceleration, we really identified a bit of a pedagogical knowledge gap. And Gregor, I think, touched on this a little bit in the question session at the end of his speech this morning, around how do we prepare our staff to be able to engage not only with the technology, but also with the pedagogy that sort of drives effective use of that technology in a way that will really engage students in their learning. And the third one was about society, but it's not society, I guess, as a whole. I guess from my perspective, I was looking very much at the academic community. So give me a little bit of artistic license here if I bring society down into a little bit more of a higher education context. But I wanted to look at what the academic community did in coming together to be able to address the pandemic and address those ideas of technology and knowledge. So it was all about communities coming together and lending a hand. But let's dive into this first story. So this one was about accelerating existing change. Now, I'm really conscious that with this international audience, you may not know very much about the institution I come from. I must admit, I didn't know very much about it before I started there 2 years ago either. But Swinburne University is a university, Swinburne University of Technology. We're based in Melbourne, in the eastern suburbs of Melbourne, in a place called Hawthorn. We have roughly 25,000 students and we have campuses all over the place. So our main campus, as I said, is in East Melbourne. We also have a few other campuses around the Melbourne area. And what I should also mention about Swinburne is we're actually a dual sector institution. So we're part university and we're part vocational education. So that's that creates an interesting dynamic also just in learning and teaching normally, but throw that into the mix of a global pandemic and it's been an exciting time for us. But we also have a very large campus in Sarawak, which is in Malaysia, and we have campuses in Sydney and Vietnam, and we seem to just be expanding all over the place. We have a new Vice Chancellor who came in during the pandemic, and she's really keen for us to be seen as a real STEM institution, so that's science, technology, engineering, mathematics type focus. And so Swinburne it's a smaller university on the scheme of things for Australia, but it's certainly a really interesting place to be, and there's a lot of innovation happening at the moment. But I want to tell you the story of us heading into the pandemic and why I'm talking about change being accelerated. So just before the pandemic hit, so at the beginning of end of 2018, the beginning of 2019, the university went through a pretty major shift in terms of our learning and teaching infrastructure. So that mainly means that we got a new learning management system. And I know other institutions, I know Melbourne's just been going through a similar process, as Gregor was from this morning. And that kind of caused quite a lot of interest in learning and teaching and how we use technology as part of that. And what we did at that stage was that we rolled out this new system, but we also rolled out a lot of support around this new system. So as I said, I'm now the director of the Learning Transformations Unit, which is a central learning and teaching unit in the institution. So when I was thinking about this particular topic, I thought, well, it would be interesting to think about what did we have to do to support an institution to change and to support the staff to be able to make that transition. But of course, we were already in transition. So as I said, we had our new learning management system. So we were moving from Blackboard to Canvas, and that created quite a lot of interest in the kinds of support activities that we did. So at the beginning of 2019, we had this quite big spike as everybody worked out how to move everything across from one learning management system to another. The idea is we wanted to do a bit of a lift and shift. So it wasn't just we're going to move things from one to another. We want to move things, but actually make them better. We want to use the technology in a more innovative way. We want to engage our students more using the technology and really start to work towards a more blended form of learning and teaching. We are predominantly a face-to-face institution. We actually do have a little offshoot company that's called Swinburne Online, and they do teach just online, but they are kind of like a separate institution to some extent, even though they have our brand on there. So for us in the sort of main part of the institution, we were interested in seeing what we could do better with technology. But as often happens with these things, time caught up with us, and it wasn't so much a lift and shift, it was really just a shift, I'll be honest. So we perhaps didn't make the changes that we had expected or wanted to do. But we thought, okay, well, 2020 will give us an opportunity. Now that we've shifted across, now we can maybe try and start that lift. So as happens at the beginning of every semester, we start to get a little bit more of an uptake of our support. So when we talk about support, we talk about workshops and training and access to resources, and we have drop-in sessions where staff can come and speak to us about specific issues that they have either with the educational technology or with pedagogy and learning design around that. So we were starting to sort of see our little bit of a peak that we usually have at the beginning of each year. But of course, then, as nobody kind of expected, we had the pandemic. I'm trying not to show the similarity between the Canvas logo and the coronavirus there. But anyway, we had the pandemic come along, and of course, that threw everything into a bit of a disarray. So whilst we had done this shift across to a new educational technology, we were still using it in a predominantly face-to-face, slightly blended way. And so the staff really needed a lot of support. So again, the services that we had to provide and the demand on these services accelerated very, very rapidly. Now, the difference between when we did this at the beginning of 2019 and when we did this in sort of March 2020, when the pandemic hit, was that in 2019, we had over 100 staff working on this transition across using the new system. But by the time we got to the beginning of 2020, we had 18 staff to move the entire institution and support our partner institutions in Sydney, Vietnam and Sarawak. So it was quite a challenge for a very small group of people. We didn't get a lot of sleep that month, or maybe ever since, but we certainly had a lot of engagement, and a lot of people were talking about learning and teaching, which from our perspective was great, because it's the thing that we really want people to be talking about all the time. So as time continued on, you know, we started to see a little bit of a drop in, so there was that sort of panic. Everybody got what they needed to do to move across really quickly. The university basically gave all the academic staff a week to get all of their teaching. So they basically stopped teaching, and then at the end of a week, they then said, right, we're now teaching fully remote delivery. And so when we looked at the kinds of sessions that our staff members were really interested in, they were things like Echo 360 and other video tools. So the quick response was, let's just record my lectures, put it up there online, and then I'll work out all the rest later on. So this was one of the first kind of bunch of professional developments that sessions that got a lot of engagement. We also had discussion forums, and the reason, the sessions around discussion forums were very popular. And the reason was that the university said, for equity reasons, we can't really teach synchronously. We have to teach asynchronously, because we can't be sure that all of our students have continued access to good internet, that they're going to have a quiet space to sit there and actually do synchronous activities. So the university said, right, no synchronous activities, let's just make everything asynchronous, because this is a bit of an emergency remote teaching situation. But the biggest challenge, so speaking of challenges and opportunities, was assessment. How do we assess when we can't do these large in a big room exams? And that was a really, really challenging thing, especially for some of our faculties who maybe sit in that more science, technology, engineering end of the spectrum. They said, but we've always done large exams. How else would we examine? And of course, the other question that came up around that too was academic integrity. If we're moving everything online, what do we do to make sure that the students aren't cheating? If they're sitting at home in their lounge rooms, as I am now, how do we know that they don't have someone sitting next to them, or they don't have a book open in front of them, and all of those sorts of things? So, and that was a really interesting conversation, I felt, because the conversation was all about the technology, but really, again, it should have been about the pedagogy. And I'll get back to that, because that's kind of a bit of a theme of where I'm going with all of this. But what we also did was we had a lot of rebels. So one of our other most popular sessions was Collaborate Ultra, which was our synchronous teaching tool. And people just sort of said, no, I need to teach synchronously. I need that connection with my students. I need to be able to see whether they're getting it. I need them to have their cameras on. And I know that several people talked before about, the blank screens and people with their cameras off and things like that. And I think the teachers were sort of reaching out for it, but also the students to some extent were reaching out to it as well. And the other thing that was really interesting was an interest in, and obviously it's my interest too, which was in learning analytics. So we use Canvas. So the Canvas new analytics tool piqued a lot of people's interest, because they said, well, how do we use the data that's being generated by what the students are doing in these online spaces, and to see whether or not they're engaged? And so I think really learning analytics in the pandemic situation was an opportunity, but it was also a challenge. And I'll get into an example of that a little bit later on. But again, when I was looking at the conference website and the themes, I noticed that there was this phrase about what we did with a lot of technology was this viral technology patch. And certainly that's how Swinburne approached it at first. It was very much, we just need to get everybody online. We just need to keep going, and then we'll deal with all of the other bigger challenges, and we'll deal with the pedagogy and we'll deal with all of those sorts of things. So what we do every semester is that during around week 4, I should say, we run a survey of our students. And because of the pandemic and closing down for a week, this survey was actually run a little bit closer to week 6. So almost halfway through the semester, we went out to the students and we said, right, how's it going? Like, what are you experiencing? How are you getting what you need? All of those sorts of questions around sort of the student experience and student satisfaction. And so when we gave that survey out to students, we did a bit of an analysis in our central unit to see what these results were telling us in terms of how the students were experiencing learning online suddenly in a global pandemic. And the really interesting thing was that all of the feedback that we got from students, so I'll give you sort of some of the key words that came through. So quality, we want quality online lectures. We need academics to be interesting and engaging and make sure their audio levels are correct and, all of those sorts of things. But that's what's really important to us, because, that video lecture was so prominent in the first semester when we moved online. They wanted consistency. They didn't want every single subject or unit that they go to be completely different, so that they had to re-navigate a different way of using the learning management system, use a whole set of new tools, all of those sorts of things. They wanted consistency in layout and in information and all of that sort of thing. They wanted clarity. Because there was change, they really needed to know what was expected now. We know what was expected at the beginning of the semester. Everything's changed. What is now the expectation from the teacher? They wanted better communication. And this was a two-way thing. They wanted to be able to speak to the academic. They wanted the academic to be able to speak to them, and they wanted to be able to speak with their peers. They wanted that connection, especially the first years who hadn't really, like, they'd been on campus for 5 minutes and then all of a sudden they're at home. So they wanted communication to be really clear as well. They wanted engagement. They wanted engagement with each other, but they also wanted engagement with the material. They wanted the material to be engaging and opportunities to actually be active in what they were doing with the material. So not just, I'm going to sit here and watch a 3-hour lecture that was recorded in my lecturer's front room, and then I might have to read a book chapter. They wanted to actually be able to do something with it. And that, I think, led into that idea of formative feedback. Because they weren't in that classroom experience, they needed to be able to gauge how they were going. They needed to be able to monitor their progress and to be able to kind of calibrate where they were at with their peers and with the feedback from the teacher. Now, what was really interesting here is that you'll notice that none of these things talk specifically to technology. The students were far more interested in how the learning and teaching was delivered from a pedagogical and, I guess, to some extent, an administrative perspective. But when we spoke to the academics, and as the semester went on and we had a little bit of drop off in support as people got a little bit more confident in how they were going, the teachers were not so interested in the pedagogy per se. They really just wanted examples. They kept saying, stop telling us about this theory and this pedagogy and all that kind of stuff. Just give us examples of technology. We want you to tell us about different tools. We want you to give us, how do I actually use Kahoot? Not how do I design questions, but just how do I log in, set up accounts, all that kind of stuff. So the focus of the teachers was very much on the technology, whereas the focus of the students was very much on the experience, on the pedagogy, and on things like communication and consistency. What it really highlighted, and I'm going to transition now into my second story of the session, is that pedagogical knowledge gap. Because the teachers, and I won't say this was all teachers, I mean, we have some wonderful teachers who do engage with the pedagogy, but the teachers as a whole were really sort of, I'll deal with that pedagogy stuff later, just get me the technology right now to teach. And I understand that to some extent, but really, if you want to use the technology in an engaging and effective way, you do need to know the pedagogy and how to use that pedagogy, because of course that will drive what makes good use of technology, what's the most appropriate technology, and so on and so forth. So this pedagogical knowledge gap, I guess, is the second story that I experienced. And at this stage, I was transitioning into the director role, and I was getting a lot more of a front row seat at what our staff knew and didn't know about pedagogy and technology. So there's lots of different ways that we talk about pedagogy and technology. And I must admit, I've come back to, a tried and tested model here just to tell the rest of this part of the story. And that's the TPAC model. So I know it's sometimes a little controversial, but I kind of like it because it's reasonably simple to be able to tell this part of the story. So this is the idea that a teacher really needs to be able to have knowledge. And of course, we're in our knowledge story in the middle of our session. We need to have technology knowledge, obviously the content knowledge of the discipline that they're teaching in, but that pedagogical knowledge. And as we discovered in the pandemic, the pedagogical knowledge was really the bit that was missing. It was the weakest link within this sort of TPAC model of where our staff were in our institution. Now, I know I'm talking about Swinburne here, but I guess you could probably say that this could apply in multiple institutions worldwide. Hopefully, maybe not so much, because hopefully all your institutions and your teaching staff are all up on the pedagogy. But I did find that this was a bit of a deficit in our particular institution. So if we look at these three things, and I'll think about a bit of a case study. So during the pandemic, and I'll put my learning analytics hat back on here, I did a lot of training on how to use learning analytics as part of learning and teaching. And whenever I do this, I don't even talk about the technology at first. I talk about things like learning design and being able to understand what you're actually asking your students to do and why you're asking them to do this, before you then think about how are you using technology to get them to do this, which then generates the data for us to be able to use as part of a learning analytics analysis to be able to then make an intervention. So maybe talk to a student, perhaps give feedback, maybe change the design for next time, all the different things you can do with learning analytics. And when I was running this session, and I ran it, I think 14 times last year, and we had quite a lot of people coming along to this particular session because they were curious to see what the data could tell us. There's a lot of data around, and I know again in the conference themes we talked about the amount of data really gave some opportunity, as it does. But one of the biggest questions I got when I was running these sessions was, how do I know if my students have read the resource that I put online? And what I guess here is the challenge. So yes, there's an opportunity because we do have the data, but a challenge here is that idea of reading. Now, we know whether a student has accessed the page on which the resource was on. We may even know if they've clicked on the resource, but how do we know if they've read it? Well, unless you're using a particular piece of technology that allows you to track that individually, and in most cases, in most of our institutions, we don't have that kind of technology, we don't know whether they've read it until we basically ask them to maybe apply it or discuss it or come back with some sort of feedback on it. And so really, it's not about the technology and the content per se. I mean, that's where I think people sort of start with. They sort of saying, oh, I need to know from the data whether people are using the technology to look at the content. But really what we need to also think about here is the pedagogy. What are we actually asking them to do with this information that would demonstrate that they actually have read or engaged with this particular material? So trying to get this message across to staff was an interesting part of our job, and an interesting challenge, but also an opportunity to say, well, if you're interested in the data, in order to be able to get to the data, you do need to understand a bit more about this pedagogy. So we used it as a little bit of an in to be able to get staff to talk about pedagogy a little bit more. So, and I guess one of the things that we're looking at now that we're past sort of the hump of the pandemic, shall we say, I mean, in Australia, we're quite lucky that we're being able to return to a lot of things, and our shops and our institutions are starting to open up again. But we're very much working in a lot more of a blended mode at the moment. We are a little bit hybrid, but we're trying as an institution to say, right, when we do come back to our more traditional face-to-face, if we want to put it that way, we do need it to be blended. We don't want to go just back to solely face-to-face. But in order to be more blended, again, this sort of triad of the technology, the content, and the pedagogy is so important. So it really does mean that we've got to focus in on upskilling our staff and providing professional learning opportunities to really make sure that we're doing this pedagogy bit better. And it's hard because it's not the fun bit. It's not necessarily the bit that all of our staff want to spend an awful lot of time on. So I'm putting this out as a question, I guess. Maybe we can talk about this in the Q&A at the end, is how do we do this better? So we've got a few different ideas about how we might do it better, and I'm happy to talk about that perhaps in the Q&A as well. But it's certainly a work in progress, and I won't say we've got the answers to this yet. But I think it's a problem that all institutions worldwide are having at the moment. How do we really get that pedagogical knowledge up to a point where people can go into a classroom and apply it, or apply it online, or apply it in a combination of those two different settings? So, and I was really quite happy during the pandemic, it's been during the pandemic, it was only a couple of months ago, that in the Times Higher Education, there was this story about the pandemic must bring faculty development to the fore. And certainly from where I sit in a central learning and teaching unit, it's really important. And whether or not that sits in your particular institution in a central unit, or whether that's something that's out in the faculties, or if you have learning and teaching champions, there's lots of different models on how this can work. We're centralised, and we do try and do this from a central point, but that is also under review in terms of how we go forward in the future. So yeah, I do really think it is a bit of a passion of mine at the moment about how do we talk about professional learning or professional development in a way that really encourages staff without having to be too draconic about it, I guess. Our colleagues in Sarawak, they have a 40-hour a year requirement that they must do 40 hours of professional development in learning and teaching per year. Now that's wonderful, but we know a lot of them come along, put their Zoom on, turn their camera off, who knows what they're doing. They've attended, have they really learned, have they engaged? Maybe, maybe not. But that's, again, something for us to look at in the future. But one other thing I did during the pandemic in my free time in lockdown was I started reading some of the books that, of course, have been sitting on my desk for a long time and I haven't had a chance to see. And this one in particular got my attention because this is around evidence-informed learning and design. And the argument here that Neelan and Kershaw make is that in learning and teaching, it's a really sophisticated, very diverse field. It's really hard to pin down and say, because I taught this way in this subject, it's going to work exactly the same way in this other subject. And what the argument they make is you can't have evidence-based learning and teaching. You can have medicine, evidence-based medicine, where you can say, if I give this drug to this person and I give this drug to another person with the similar characteristics, it's probably going to do the same thing. But they said with learning and teaching, it may not do that because of the way that the teacher may be slightly different, or the way that the student has different preferences towards their learning. So they talk about evidence-informed learning design. And I guess what this did was get me thinking about how do we bring all this wealth of evidence that we have across all of our, our institutions, we have in our journals in learning and teaching, we have in our professional societies. So Tamsin was struggling there before on the word Ascolite. Ascolite is a professional society around educational technology in Australia, and they do some wonderful community building and professional development or professional learning activities. And so this takes me into my third story, and I know I'm getting close to time, so I will wrap up soon, Tamsin. My third story about communities lending a hand, because I thought, how do we actually start talking about some of this evidence in a way that teachers can actually engage with it? And it's not going to be overwhelming, and it's going to be in a language that they understand and can then apply to their own practice fairly easily. Now, there were lots of different ways that we saw this happen across the pandemic. Lots of people wrote stories for things like the Times Higher Ed. We had a number of things coming through the main media. In Australia here, we have a thing called The Conversation, and I think there are other versions of The Conversation across the world. And they sort of posed a lot of different questions. What does this pandemic mean for learning and teaching? What does this mean for higher education more broadly? And vocational education, because of course we're dual sector. And it was really great to see all of this wealth of knowledge kind of start to bubble up in a slightly more accessible form than it perhaps had been previously. So I am a member of Ascolite, but I'm also a member, or at the beginning of the pandemic, I was an associate editor for the Australasian Journal of Educational Technology. And so with the lead editors of that journal, I undertook an activity where we went out on Twitter and we said to everyone, right, we've got this journal of 25 years of 35 years of information about how to use technology to teach really well. And here's a really great opportunity for us to actually delve into some of this information. So we created a little bit of a Twitter campaign where we profiled a number of really great papers. So we got all of our associate editors and we said, right, tell us papers that you think would be really useful in this particular context. And so we came up with a list of 20 or so papers, and then we tweeted about them and we put them out there. And it was great. We had a lot of really great engagement with this. And what we then did is we then summarized all of this into a blog, and we went through all the different papers that we had profiled, and we said, here are these, and we tried to make sure that papers hit on particular issues that were really prevalent and important within the pandemic. So engaging students online, dealing with equity in teaching online, a whole bunch of different things, using particular educational technology tools. The students themselves, how do they experience the being taught online, I guess. So we brought this together in this blog. But what was really great was it wasn't just us that was doing this. There were a lot of other things. So I just found one example from the Journal of Information and Learning Sciences. And so normally a journal behind a paywall, they said, right, we're going to give you free access to an issue of all what we consider the most relevant articles to our time in this pandemic and teaching in this hybrid or in most cases fully online mode. So as I said, the communities came together to really surface up this information so that people were able to engage with this. And there was one other thing that I'll finish off on this story on one other example is that in my learning analytics work, I look at lots of different ways that we can research, lots of different ways that we can use data. And I'm very much a mixed methods researcher, but probably a bit more predominantly a qualitative researcher. And that annoys a lot of the learning analytics community because they like numbers. And so there's a lot of new techniques and methodologies that are emerging within this community. And a lot of them are actually trying to look at how do we take qualitative data and quantify it to some extent to help us to surface up more information, trends, useful insights into the kinds of things that we're doing. And a lot of this, so one particular community that I've connected with, and it's quite, I call it sort of like a sister community to the learning analytics community, is the community around quantitative ethnography. Now, I know that sounds like two very, very long words, and I'm not going to go into a huge amount of detail about what this is, but just before the pandemic, there was the emergence of the International Society for Quantitative Ethnography. And this is really all about looking at, as I said before, qualitative data, and often data that's around conversations or interviews or things like that, and quantifying it slightly so that we can start to look for trends and patterns and relationships between this data. And what this particular community did at the beginning of the pandemic was it said, well, we've got this great method that really emerged out of a lot of educational research from the University of Wisconsin Madison, and David Williamson Schaefer, I guess is what you would call the father of quantitative ethnography. So it came out of research that was done around how do we use games as part of learning, and all sorts of things like that. So it sort of came from an educational perspective, but it's now used transdisciplinary, as they say. So it's very prevalent now in things like health research and other social science research and things like that. So they said, how can we take this method and apply this to the pandemic to really help build knowledge around not just higher education, but just our understanding of the pandemic more generally. So they created this thing called the Quantitative Ethnography Community COVID Data Challenge. So we took this huge amount of information, this a lot of data that was coming through many, many different channels. And we got people from all around the world. They got people from all around the world. And we came together with our expertise in research and in this particular methodology. And we looked at lots of different ways of thinking about the pandemic. We looked at the political messaging around the pandemic. We looked at health messaging across different countries. I actually was in a group, our team was looking at the messaging around the use of masks as part of the pandemic. And so, and it was really interesting. So there was one of the teams, this is a team with quite a lot of Australian, American and New Zealand people in it. And they looked at the differences in how Donald Trump was talking about the pandemic, as opposed to Jacinda Ardern, who is the Prime Minister of New Zealand, and the different emphasis they had on the medical side of things versus the economy versus the political and so on and so forth. So it was really interesting to use things, methodologies that had come from higher education and had come from educational research to look at society a bit more broadly. So I guess I did end on my last story on society, looking at society a little bit more broadly than I said I would at the beginning. But just to come back, so here were the sort of the summary of the three things we looked at. We accelerated our existing change. And in doing that, we really identified this pedagogical knowledge gap. And I think that is an opportunity and a challenge going forward. An opportunity because more people are thinking about learning and teaching now because of the pandemic, but a challenge because it's hard to make pedagogy sexy all the time. So we do need to try and get people engaged and interested in what we can do with pedagogy. But what was really wonderful to see in all of this was the communities coming together, lending a hand and surfacing up some of that really great knowledge that we've had in our field for a long time, but perhaps wasn't necessarily getting out as broadly as we would like. So yeah, I guess that's probably my the end of my talk there. I guess I'll throw to questions. I'll stop sharing my screen so that I can see you all, but hopefully that gave you a bit of an insight into the experience that or the different perspectives I had throughout the pandemic, but I'm pretty sure many of you would have shared some of the same kinds of experiences as we went through.